Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder how your brain decides what to pay attention to, especially when there is a lot going on? This new study dives into exactly that. Imagine walking into a busy cafe. Your brain has to pick out the conversation you want to hear from all the background noise, the clatter of cups, and the music. How does it do that? And what happens when it can't? Researchers are exploring this idea called memory-guided selective attention. It suggests that instead of our brain constantly trying to figure out what to focus on from scratch, it might actually use past experiences to automatically guide our attention. It is like your brain has a shortcut saying, hey, I've been in a similar situation before and this is what worked then, so let's do that again. Now, the challenge for scientists is proving this idea. A common way to study this is using something called the Stroop task. You know, where you see a word like red and you have to say the color of the ink it is written in. If the word is red written in red ink, it is easy and fast. But if the word is red written in green ink, your brain gets a bit confused because the word itself tells you one color, but the ink is another. This conflict is what they measure. Previous studies have shown that if you put these Stroop-like tasks in different settings or contexts, with varying levels of difficulty, your brain learns to adapt. For example, one context might have lots of confusing trials, and another might have mostly straightforward ones. The problem is, in those older studies, the same words and colors were repeated a lot. This meant the brain could be learning through simple repetition and associations, not necessarily through something as sophisticated as memory, guided attention to the context itself. So, the researchers in this study came up with a brilliant idea. They created a trial-unique Stroop task. This means every single time a word appeared, it was completely new. It never repeated throughout the entire experiment. This is super important because it stops the brain from learning through simple repetition. It forces the brain to rely on something else, like the context of the trial, to figure out how to manage the task. They set up two different contexts. In one context, most of the trials were confusing or incongruent. That is the high conflict zone. In the other context, most of the trials were easy or congruent. That is the low conflict zone. They wanted to see if the brain would learn to expect a certain level of difficulty for each context and adjust its attention accordingly. To make these contexts distinct, they used a combination of cues. For example, one context might always have words in blue on the left side of the screen, spoken in a male voice, while the other context might have words in red on the right side, spoken in a female voice. They made sure these cues were all linked together for each context. So, what did they find in experiment 1? Drumroll please. They discovered that participants actually performed better, meaning they had smaller congruency effects, or less confusion, in the low conflict context compared to the high conflict context. What does this mean? It means that when the environment was generally easier, their brain could figure out how to handle the occasional tricky trial. But when the environment was consistently difficult, their brain seemed to adapt and become better at managing that difficulty. This strongly suggests that the context itself was acting as a cue, and the brain was using its memory of past experiences in that context to adjust its attention. But the story doesn't end there. Scientists love to test their findings, and they also like to see why something works. So, in experiment 2, they wanted to know if all those different cues they used, like color, location, and voice, were equally important. They divided participants into 3 groups. One group experienced both visual and auditory cues, just like in experiment 1. Another group only had auditory cues like the voice and sound location. And the third group only had visual cues like color and screen position. And this is where it gets really interesting. They found that the context-specific effect, that pattern of better performance in the low-conflict context, occurred when participants had both visual and auditory cues, and also when they only had visual cues. But, and this is a big but, they didn't find this effect when participants only had auditory cues. This means that visual cues like color and where the word appears on the screen were really effective at signaling the level of difficulty. Auditory cues, however, weren't enough on their own to trigger this adaptive attention. It is like the brain pays more attention to what it sees when trying to predict how hard a task will be. So, what is the big takeaway here? This study provides strong evidence that our memories of past environments can automatically guide our attention. It's not always a conscious effort. The context itself, especially visual cues, can act as a trigger, reminding our brain how to expect and manage conflict. This is super cool because it suggests our cognitive control system is incredibly flexible and can learn and adapt in subtle, automatic ways. Now, let's think about the limitations. The study did find that auditory cues alone weren't sufficient. This doesn't mean auditory cues are useless for attention. It might be that in this specific task, visual cues simply provided a stronger signal. Or perhaps it is about whether the cues are linked to where you are supposed to be looking or where the distraction is coming from. The researchers even suggest future studies could flip the task around to see if auditory cues become more important when they're the primary focus. This research opens up a lot of possibilities. It helps explain why we sometimes feel more focused in certain places or situations. It also highlights how our brains are constantly learning, even without us realizing it. Think about how you might navigate a familiar route versus a new one. Your internal context settings are likely very different. This could have implications for how we design learning environments or even how we understand things like ADHD, where controlling attention is a core challenge. Overall, this is a really neat study that uses a clever design to get at a fundamental question about how our attention works. It shows that our memories are powerful tools shaping how we interact with the world around us, often without us even noticing. It is a reminder that our minds are constantly at work, learning and adapting, using the past to navigate the present. If you found this as interesting as I did, please give this video a thumbs up. Let me know in the comments what you think about memory guiding your attention. And don't forget to subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more breakdowns of the latest brain science. Thanks for watching.